Imagine sitting in the suffocating, dust-choked basement of a municipal library. The harsh, erratic hum of overhead fluorescent lights casts long, cinematic shadows across the cold linoleum floor. You are sitting at a heavy, industrial steel microfiche reader, your hands carefully threading a brittle, yellowed roll of 16mm microfilm through the mechanical glass plates. You are looking for a specific front-page headline from October 1953. You know the headline exists because your grandfather spoke of it in hushed, terrified whispers. You crank the heavy plastic dial, the screen flashing with the high-contrast, black and white ghosts of the mid-century American press. You find the exact date. You find the front page. But right where the lead story should be, there is nothing but a glaring, perfectly rectangular void of white light. The physical, original newspaper wasn't just censored. The column was surgically excised with a razor blade before the microfilm photograph was ever taken. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across the entire country, in thousands of archives, police precincts, and federal depositories, the name, the face, and the staggering criminal empire of the most dangerous man in America were systematically, physically annihilated. He was a man who wielded more raw, terrifying power than Al Capone, yet today, his name yields absolutely nothing. He was erased, and the entity that ordered his complete deletion from the historical record is the single most terrifying aspect of this classified mystery. Welcome to the Wayne Archive, the digital vault, where we resurrect the heavily redacted, the violently suppressed, and the completely forgotten shadows of American history. When we think of the great criminal masterminds of the 20th century, we think of the men who craved the spotlight. We think of Al Capone smoking heavy Cuban cigars for the press cameras, or John Dillinger flashing a charismatic, arrogant smile as he was escorted into a flashbulb-lit courthouse. Their infamy was their armor. But true, absolute power does not tolerate publicity. The man buried deep within this specific sealed manila folder operated on a completely different, infinitely more dangerous echelon. He didn't run corner rackets or street-level bootlegging operations. He ran the architecture of the 1950s American metropolis. He controlled the heavy steel shipping unions, the deep water ports, and the very politicians who drafted the federal laws. He was a phantom who realized that if you own the men who write the history books, you can edit yourself out of the narrative entirely. Today, we are breaking the seal on a 70-year-old classified cover-up. We are going to reconstruct the empire of the ghost, analyze the chilling mechanical process of his historical erasure, and expose the massive, high-level conspiracy that traded justice for absolute silence. Lower the blinds, turn off the lights, and let's step back into the dark. To fully grasp the sheer, paralyzing scale of this cover-up, you must first understand the absolute, undeniable fame this man possessed before the erasure began. Let us refer to him by his street moniker, the Architect. By the early 1950s, the Architect was not a myth. He was a highly visible, towering titan of industry and organized crime. During the post-war economic boom, when America was building massive interstate highways and towering skyscrapers, the Architect controlled the concrete, the heavy structural steel, and the thousands of men required to pour it. He didn't operate out of a dimly lit speakeasy. His headquarters was a sprawling, opulent penthouse suite in a gleaming, modern corporate high-rise. He rode through the rain-slicked, neon-lit streets in a massive, armored 1952 Cadillac Series 75, Fleetwood, its heavy chrome grille reflecting the terrified, respectful glances of the local beat cops who were all firmly on his payroll. His face, featuring a sharp, unyielding jawline and cold, highly calculating eyes set beneath the brim of a pristine charcoal gray fedora, was printed in 72-point bold ink on the cover of every major national broadsheet. The press documented his every move, photographing his tailored, heavy worsted wool suits and the expensive silk ties he wore while testifying with absolute, arrogant impunity before the United States Senate investigative committees. The American public feared him, but they were also deeply, morbidly obsessed with him. He was the ultimate, untouchable apex predator of the Kodachrome era. And then, in the brutally cold winter of 1955, the narrative simply stopped. It did not fade away gradually. It was a sudden, violent, and highly coordinated institutional blackout. In the 1950s, erasing a human being was an incredibly difficult, physical, and labor-intensive process. There were no digital databases to discreetly wipe with a few keystrokes. Information was heavy, tangible, and highly distributed. It existed on millions of printed pages, bound legal ledgers, and miles of highly flammable celluloid film. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, operating under a highly classified, undocumented executive directive, initiated a nationwide purge known internally as Operation Blank Slate. The process was executed with a chilling mechanical ruthlessness. Heavily armed federal agents, their heavily wrinkled, calloused hands encased in black leather gloves, physically seized the printing plates of the major newspaper syndicates. They raided the independent photojournalism bureaus, exposing thousands of pristine, medium-format Kodachrome negatives to raw light, completely burning the images of the architect into white nothingness. The physical erasure extended deep into the federal justice system itself. Court clerks across the eastern seaboard arrived at work to find the heavy, brass-locked filing cabinets completely gutted. Years of highly detailed grand jury testimony, wiretap transcripts recorded on heavy magnetic tape, and thousands of booking photographs were loaded into unmarked, heavy-duty cargo trucks. They were driven to industrial incineration facilities and fed directly into roaring, 2,000-degree cast-iron furnaces. The heavy black ash that drifted out of the smokestacks was the only remaining physical evidence that the greatest criminal mastermind in the country had ever existed. But the most terrifying aspect of the erasure was not the destruction of paper. It was the aggressive psychological silencing of the human witnesses. Investigative reporters who had spent years tracking the architect's movements were visited in the dead of night by men in dark, anonymous sedans. There were no dramatic, cinematic shootouts. The threats were delivered quietly, professionally, and with absolute, undeniable authority. The journalists were presented with heavily documented files detailing their own personal lives, their children's schools, their spouses' routines, their private financial debts. The message was explicitly clear. The name of the architect was never to be spoken, typed, or published again. The men who wrote the news suddenly suffered from a collective, institutional amnesia. The entire American law enforcement apparatus, the free press, and the federal government had seemingly joined forces to protect a man they were sworn to destroy. The ultimate question is not how they executed the purge. We know the physical mechanics of the cover-up. The terrifying, unanswered question that still haunts the darkest corners of the National Archives is why. What could a criminal syndicate boss possibly possess that would force the United States government to completely dismantle its own historical record to protect him? To answer the terrifying question of why the federal government would physically cannibalize its own historical archives to protect a syndicate boss, we must examine the geopolitical nightmare of the mid-1950s. This was the absolute, suffocating zenith of the Cold War. The American public was paralyzed by the constant existential dread of atomic annihilation. The political atmosphere in Washington was highly toxic, dominated by the paranoid, heavy-handed witch hunts of McCarthyism. The federal government was operating in a state of absolute, unchecked secrecy, funding highly classified, undocumented intelligence operations to combat the perceived Soviet threat. But to move illicit assets, untraceable currency, and black market weaponry across international borders without congressional oversight, the intelligence apparatus needed an infrastructure that existed completely off the grid. They could not use military transports. They had to use the deep-water civilian ports of the eastern seaboard. And those massive, heavy steel shipping lanes were entirely, unconditionally controlled by the architect. The collision between the American intelligence community and the criminal underworld was inevitable, but the architect did not view the federal government as an adversary. He viewed them as a highly lucrative, infinitely exploitable client. He facilitated the movement of their Black Ops cargo, ensuring the heavy wooden crates bypassed customs inspections and union dockworker strikes. But the architect was a man defined by a cold, calculating paranoia. He knew that the moment he was no longer useful, the government would eliminate him. To secure his survival, he executed the most audacious, high-stakes insurance policy in the history of American crime. He didn't just facilitate the shipments. He meticulously documented every single transaction. He created what is referred to in classified intelligence whispers as the shadow ledger. This was not a metaphorical concept. It was a physical, massive, brass-bound accounting book. Within its heavy, watermarked pages, the architect recorded the exact dates, the cargo manifests, the illicit financial transfers, and, most devastatingly, the authentic forged signatures of the highest-ranking federal directors and senators who were explicitly authorizing these illegal, treasonous operations. He possessed the physical, undeniable proof that the American government was actively utilizing the criminal underworld to bypass the United States Constitution. In the winter of 1955, the Department of Justice, completely unaware of the covert arrangement between the architect and the intelligence sector, finally managed to secure a rock-solid, irrefutable RICO indictment against him for racketeering and extortion. They were preparing to drag him into a highly publicized, flashbulb-lit federal courtroom. The architect realized the trap was closing, and he played his trump card. He sent a single, heavily redacted page of the shadow ledger directly to the director of the FBI and the Secretary of Defense. The message was implicit, ruthless, and absolute. If he was placed on a public witness stand, if his defense attorneys were allowed to enter evidence into public discovery, the shadow ledger would be submitted to the press. The resulting scandal would not just end political careers. It would fundamentally shatter the American public's faith in their own government during the most fragile, terrifying era of the atomic age. It would expose the United States to massive international humiliation and domestic collapse. The federal government was cornered. They could not assassinate him, because the architect had established a dead man's switch. If his heart stopped beating, multiple trusted couriers were instructed to deliver the ledger to the leading syndicated newspapers. They could not put him on trial, because the evidence would become a matter of public record. There was only one solution. The architect demanded an agreement that transcended a simple presidential pardon. A pardon leaves a permanent paper trail. A pardon acknowledges guilt. The architect demanded absolute, systemic annihilation of his entire existence. He demanded to be unwritten. The execution of this unholy pact culminated on a freezing, torrential night in late November 1955, on a heavily classified, abandoned military airstrip hidden deep within the dense pine forests of Virginia. The atmosphere was ripped straight from the climax of a noir thriller. The heavy driving rain slicked the cracked asphalt, reflecting the harsh yellow headlights of three unmarked black 1954 Plymouth sedans. In the center of the tarmac sat a matte black Douglas DC-3 transport plane, its heavy twin Pratt & Whitney radial engines idling with a deep, rhythmic, deafening thud that vibrated through the soles of the shoes of the men standing in the rain. The architect stepped out of the lead vehicle. He was wearing his signature heavy charcoal trench coat, the collar turned up against the biting wind, his face completely devoid of emotion. He was met on the tarmac by two men. They wore no badges, no identifying insignia, and they carried no umbrellas. They were the highest echelon fixers the federal government possessed. The exchange was entirely physical and completely silent. The architect handed over a heavy waterproof leather satchel. Inside was the shadow ledger, the complete, unredacted, physical proof of the government's darkest treason. In return, the federal agents handed the architect a slim, manila folder. Inside that folder was a completely manufactured, flawless identity. It contained genuine, government-issued passports, pristine birth certificates, and untraceable international banking codes, granting him access to heavily guarded Swiss accounts funded directly by the Federal Reserve, a literal taxpayer-funded severance package for the most dangerous man in the country. The architect didn't smile. He simply nodded, turned his back on the American justice system, and climbed the aluminum stairs of the DC-3. The heavy steel door locked shut. The radial engines roared to a deafening pitch, and the massive aircraft lifted off into the heavy, storm-choked sky, carrying the ghost out of the jurisdiction of reality. The aftermath of his departure was managed with the same chilling, mechanical precision as the archival erasure. To prevent a massive, bloody gang war over the sudden vacuum of power, the federal government covertly dismantled his empire from the top down. They orchestrated targeted, localized arrests of his lieutenants, feeding them false information that the architect had been secretly executed by a rival syndicate, ensuring the criminal underworld never knew he had actually beaten the system. The architect lived out the rest of his natural life in absolute, opulent anonymity. Whether he resided in a heavily fortified villa on the coast of the Mediterranean or a massive, secluded estate in South America, He completely evaded the fate of every other famous mobster in American history. He never saw the inside of an Alcatraz cell. He never fell in a hail of bullets on a bloody sidewalk. He achieved the ultimate, impossible victory. He weaponized the government's own corruption against them, forcing the most powerful nation on earth to act as his personal cleaning crew. When we walk through the pristine marble halls of our national archives, we operate under the comforting illusion that history is an absolute, undeniable truth. We believe that the ink printed on the pages of our newspapers and the heavy locked files of the federal justice system are the final, objective record of our society. But the terrifying saga of the architect proves that history is not a permanent monument. It is a highly malleable, easily manipulated narrative, written by the victors and heavily edited by those who hold the darkest leverage. The most dangerous criminal in American history didn't just escape the law. He forced the law to actively erase his footprints. He proved that true, absolute power operates strictly in the shadows, entirely immune to the consequences of the spotlight. If this deep dive into the most highly classified, violently suppressed cover-up of the 1950s made you question the history book sitting on your shelf, hit that subscribe button and join us here at the Wayne Archive. We are relentlessly committed to finding the missing microfilm, reading the redacted lines, and exposing the ghosts the government prayed would stay buried forever. Review the psychological mechanics of the blackmail, analyze the political timeline, and drop your theories down in the comments section below. Who do you think was truly calling the shots in 1950s America? The politicians in the light or the phantoms in the dark? Thank you for stepping into the archive with us today, and remember, the absence of evidence is sometimes the most terrifying evidence of all.